The final bell had rung 5 months ago, but Grace Whitmore still heard its echo in her mind some mornings, sharp, distant, like a memory that refused to soften. At 70, her days had grown slow and quiet in her small Asheville bungalow, where the scent of old paper and dried lavender lingered like the remnants of a life once filled with motion and noise. Once a pillar of the local elementary school, Ms. Whitmore had taught for over 4 decades. Her name had been etched in the minds of hundreds of children, some who went on to become doctors, others who simply remembered her as the only adult who ever looked them in the eyes and truly listened. She'd never married, never had children of her own. Her students had been her family, her classroom, her legacy. And yet, her retirement had passed without ceremony. She had asked for it that way. No parties, no speeches, no applause. Just the turning of a key in her old classroom door one last time, and a final walk down the polished hallway that had carried so many little feet over the years. But the silence that followed had surprised her. On the morning of her 70th birthday, Grace rose early. She poured her coffee and sat alone at her kitchen table, staring out the window as the golden light of late spring filtered through the magnolia tree. No calls, no cards. She didn't expect them. Her only living relative, her younger sister Miriam, hadn't spoken to her in over 20 years. Grace told herself the solitude was peaceful. But when the doorbell rang just after 10, she startled like someone had shouted her name in a crowd. On her porch sat a large brown box wrapped in thick twine, no return address. The handwriting on the tag, to Ms. Grace Whitmore, was careful, almost childlike. Inside, folded delicately in layers of tissue, was a quilt. Not just any quilt, a masterpiece. Hand-stitched with vivid colors and worn fabrics, each square told a story. Faded denim from a pair of overalls, a scrap of plaid from a school uniform, a corner of what might have once been a Halloween costume. Each square bore an embroidered name. Names Grace recognized instantly. Names she hadn't spoken in decades. Emily S., class of '89. Jordan T., class of '94. Carlos V., class of '81. Even little Sadie M., who used to sneak sunflower seeds into her math books. A lump rose in her throat. She ran her fingers across each square, tears blurring her vision. But then, one name stopped her cold. For Annie B., wherever she is. The room fell still. Annie B., a girl with pale blue eyes and tangled auburn hair. A quiet child who used to hum while coloring, who never raised her hand, who vanished without a trace in the fall of 1989. The case had haunted Grace for years. No answers, no closure. One day Annie was in her class, and then she wasn't. Grace's hands trembled as she held the square. It was a muted purple fabric, stitched with extra care, almost reverent in its simplicity. The phrase, "wherever she is," was like a whisper from the past that refused to stay buried. She leaned back in her chair, the quilt pooling in her lap like a weight of unspoken memories. Who had made this? Who knew to include Annie? And why, after all these years, was this quilt arriving now? As the camera pans out on Grace sitting alone in her kitchen, bathed in the golden hush of morning, her gaze remains fixed on that square, on Annie's name, stitched into fabric like a secret someone finally wanted her to see. The quilt didn't leave Grace's side for days. She draped it across the back of her couch like a shrine, often catching herself running her fingertips over the squares, each one like a doorway into another life. Some names glowed with warmth, sparking faint memories of birthday cupcakes in the classroom, scraped knees and spelling tests. Others were dimmer, blurred by the years, their stories harder to place. But one name refused to fade, Annie B. Grace hadn't slept well since the quilt arrived. Her mind spun with questions she couldn't answer. Who had sent it? Why now? And most urgently, why include a girl who'd disappeared without a trace nearly 40 years ago? She sat at her kitchen table and opened her old leather-bound grade book, dust-covered but intact. Slowly, carefully, she began cross-referencing names on the quilt with the students she once taught. Then, she picked up the phone. Her first call was to Lindsay Pearson, now Lindsay Walker, one of her brightest students from the class of '94, now a guidance counselor in Atlanta. "Oh my gosh, Ms. Whitmore. I can't believe you called. Lindsay said, emotion in her voice. You were everything to me. I still have the letter you wrote me in 6th grade when my dad left. They spoke warmly for a few minutes, reminiscing about book fairs, class field trips, and the quiet afternoons when Grace would let Lindsay read in the window seat instead of going out for recess. When Grace mentioned the quilt, there was a pause. I contributed a square, Lindsay admitted. We were contacted by someone, but it wasn't you. Who contacted you? A man. Said he was helping collect stories for your birthday. He didn't say much. I just mailed him the square. Grace's heart beat faster. Do you remember his name? No. Just that he sounded young. Gentle, maybe early 30s? He said it was for a good cause, and I believed him. Was it not you? Grace thanked her and hung up, now more unsettled than ever. Someone had taken time to find her former students, some of whom she hadn't spoken to in decades. Someone who had known enough to include Annie B. She kept calling. Over the next few days, she spoke to nearly a dozen former students. Most had warm memories of her. A few were hesitant, carefully polite, their voices tinged with discomfort. And then came the call with Devin Ross, now a firefighter in Charlotte. I didn't think you'd ever call me, Devin said, his voice low and distant. I hope it's not unwelcome, Grace replied. I was going through some names and yours was on the quilt. Devin let out a long breath. Here's the thing, Ms. Whitmore. I don't think I ever had you as a teacher. Grace paused. Are you sure? I remember your name. I know. I remember you too. But not you. There was a woman who looked just like you. Same voice, same posture. But different. Different how? She used to sit with us in the art room sometimes. Read to us in the library. Said she was a substitute or a helper. But no one ever really knew her name. And she always said she was Ms. Whitmore. Grace felt a chill crawl up her spine. Devin continued. I just always assumed maybe she was your sister or something. Or maybe you'd transferred to our school. I was 8. I didn't question much. Grace hung up, her hand trembling. Her next move was instinctual. She pulled the quilt into her lap and began inspecting the borders, the hem, the stitching, the backing. Her hands slowed as she noticed something she hadn't seen before. Near the bottom edge, hidden under a layer of folded cloth, was a small hand-stitched seam, tighter and more deliberate than the rest. Grace carefully loosened it with a pair of sewing scissors. A tiny slip of paper fell out, brittle with age. It was handwritten in slanted cursive. Forgive her. She only wanted to help. Her breath caught. The words sank like a stone into the pit of her stomach. They were familiar. Not in tone, but in guilt. She stared at them for a long time, as if the ink might shift and offer more answers. Who are you? She whispered. And what did you do? The note haunted Grace more than she cared to admit. She couldn't stop turning those words over in her mind. Forgive her. She only wanted to help. Who was she? And what had she done? There was only one person who might know, the one person Grace had tried to forget for years, her younger sister, Miriam. Grace hadn't spoken to Miriam since that bitter argument 2 decades ago, a fight so raw it severed their relationship completely. Miriam's struggles with mental illness had driven a wedge between them, a chasm too wide for Grace's quiet patience. But now, with the quilt's cryptic message hanging like a shadow over her heart, Grace realized there was no one else to turn to. After hours of pacing her living room, Grace finally picked up the phone and dialed Miriam's number, a number she'd memorized but never used in years. The line rang, and then a hesitant voice answered. Grace. The voice was softer than Grace remembered, tinged with vulnerability and regret. Miriam, it's me, Grace said carefully. I received something I think you need to see. There was a pause, heavy with unsaid words. I'm coming over, Miriam said finally. When Miriam arrived at the modest Asheville bungalow, the sisters sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the quilt spread out between them like a fragile bridge. Miriam's eyes were red-rimmed, her hands trembling as she reached for a square. "I didn't want this to come out like this," she whispered. "I thought I was helping you, helping those kids. Especially Annie." Grace's heart clenched. "I used to pretend I was you," Miriam confessed, voice cracking. "At school. At first, it was just small things, helping students after class, reading to them during lunch. But then, I thought, maybe I could do better. For Annie, for the ones who didn't have anyone." Tears welled in Grace's eyes, but she stayed silent, listening. "I know it sounds crazy," Miriam continued, "but I couldn't stand watching Annie suffer. She never told you everything, but I did. I was there. I talked to her when no one else would. And when she vanished, I stayed quiet. I was scared." Grace struggled to find words. The sister she had mourned, the distant, unpredictable Miriam, was sitting right here, unraveling a secret that could shatter them both. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I was ashamed," Miriam admitted. "I thought you'd hate me. That I'd ruin your life. I wanted to protect you. I wanted to protect Annie." Grace's breath hitched. The weight of Miriam's secret settled between them like a storm cloud. The quilt suddenly felt heavier, woven not just with threads and memories, but with lies, guilt, and a desperate hope for redemption. As the evening shadows deepened, Miriam reached out and took Grace's hand. "I'm sorry, Grace. I kept so much from you. But I want to make this right." Grace nodded slowly, a mixture of sorrow and reluctant hope filling her chest. The weight of Miriam's confession lingered in the air long after she left. Grace sat alone at the dining table, fingers tracing the worn edges of the quilt. The pieces of the past were beginning to unravel, each stitch tugging her deeper into a mystery she never expected to face. Determined to find answers, Grace decided to visit the school archives. The building had changed little over the decades, a familiar brick facade, the same creaky wooden floors, but the records room was a maze of dust-covered files and yellowed folders. She requested Annie's student file from the clerk, expecting to relive memories of that quiet girl who had slipped through the cracks. Instead, she was met with an unsettling silence. "I'm sorry, Ms. Whitmore," the clerk said gently, eyes downcast. "Annie's file, it's missing." Grace's heart skipped a beat. How can that be? What happened to it? No one knows. It disappeared years ago. We've searched, but it's as if it was erased. That same afternoon, Grace found herself wandering the school hallways, searching for someone who might remember more. She spotted Mr. Ellison, the retired janitor, sweeping near the gym entrance. "Mr. Ellison, do you remember Annie B?" Grace asked softly. He nodded slowly, eyes clouding with memory. "Yes, ma'am. Little thing. Quiet. But I saw something once I never told anyone. One afternoon, I found her in the basement, crying. And she wasn't alone." Grace's pulse quickened. "Who was with her?" He hesitated, then whispered. "A woman who looked just like you. Same hair, same voice. But it wasn't you, Ms. Whitmore. I swear." A chill ran down Grace's spine as a flashback flickered in her mind. Annie, small and trembling, confiding in someone who wasn't quite herself, sharing stories of bruises and broken promises. Back home, the quilt beckoned again. As Grace studied it, a corner of one fabric square began to fray. She pulled gently, and a faded photograph slipped out. It was Annie, smiling softly but with a dark bruise shadowing her cheek. Behind her, half hidden in the blurry background, stood a woman, her face unmistakably Miriam's. Grace stared, breath caught in her throat. This was no ordinary memory. It was a goodbye. A silent plea stitched into the fabric of their lives. Tears pricked at her eyes, but her resolve hardened. If Miriam was involved, if she had kept secrets about Annie's pain, Grace had to know the whole truth, no matter where it led. Grace couldn't shake the image of Annie's bruised face, the photo hidden in the quilt, a painful accusation she couldn't ignore. The thought that Miriam had kept secrets from her was a jagged shard in her heart. But more troubling was the question, what else had Miriam hidden? Driven by a restless need for answers, Grace began visiting the homes of other former students featured in the quilt. Each doorstep opened a new window into lives she'd once touched, now marked by triumph or tragedy. Her first visit was to Rebecca Taylor, a single mother in her 40s, juggling 2 kids and a night shift job. Rebecca's voice cracked when she mentioned her mother, who had spent years in prison. "My mom was arrested when I was 10, Rebecca said, her eyes downcast. Social services said Ms. Whitmore reported her for neglect. I never knew why." "You didn't do that, did you?" Grace shook her head emphatically. "No, Rebecca. That wasn't me." Rebecca looked puzzled. "But someone used your name. It was all over the court papers." The pieces began to fall into place. Miriam, pretending to be Grace, had been stepping into families' lives, making decisions meant to protect children but done without permission, without explanation. Visiting more former students, Grace discovered a troubling pattern: reports and interventions under her name, calls to authorities she never made, and a web of secrecy Miriam had spun over decades. One afternoon, a square stitched with the initials TC caught her eye. It was worn and patched over, clearly old. A quick search led Grace to a weathered farmhouse on the outskirts of Asheville, where a man named Thomas Carter, now in his early 50s, lived alone. Thomas answered the door cautiously, but when Grace mentioned the quilt, his guarded expression softened. "My mom died when I was a kid," Thomas said, voice thick with emotion. "She told me once that someone claiming to be Ms. Whitmore came around, said she was there to help me. But I never saw her again." Grace's eyes fell on the weather-beaten chest in the corner of the living room. "May I?" she asked. Thomas nodded. Inside the chest were faded photos, letters, and a bundle of old clothes, some bearing the same fabrics used in the quilt. The realization hit her: Miriam's secret efforts to intervene, sometimes saving children from harm, sometimes tearing families apart, had been hidden in plain sight. And the final puzzle piece awaited. In the chest, beneath the letters, was a locked box with a fragile tag: "For Grace, when you're ready." Grace's hands trembled. Whatever was inside might change everything she thought she knew about her sister, and Annie. Grace sat cross-legged on the floor of Thomas Carter's living room, the locked chest open before her like a time capsule of secrets and pain. The dim light from the single lamp cast long shadows on the peeling wallpaper, and the air smelled faintly of dust and old paper. Inside, she found stacks of yellowed letters, each carefully folded and addressed to names she recognized: students from the quilt, children Miriam had once watched over. The handwriting was delicate, sometimes shaky, but always filled with a fierce kindness. With trembling fingers, Grace unfolded one of the letters. "Dear Sarah, if you're reading this, know that someone is watching over you, even when it feels like the world has forgotten. I see your courage, and I believe in you." Grace's eyes welled with tears as she read each note. Miriam had not only watched over these children, she had become their secret guardian, offering advice, comfort, and warnings in a way only someone deeply connected could. But the letters also revealed a darker truth: Miriam's protective acts were sometimes misguided. She had crossed lines, intervened without consent, sometimes sowing confusion and fear. One letter stood apart, folded with extra care. "Grace, I kept my promise. I took Annie where no one could hurt her again. Please forgive me." Grace's heart thundered. The words echoed the note hidden in the quilt's hem: "Forgive her. She only wanted to help." For the first time, Grace glimpsed Miriam's mind, the fierce love twisted by trauma, the desperate hope to protect children no one else saw. Yet with love came consequences. A folded newspaper clipping in the chest told of a scandal: families torn apart, social workers baffled, a community whispering about a mystery woman acting under Grace Whitmore's name. Grace leaned back, overwhelmed but determined. Miriam's actions had been reckless, perhaps even dangerous. But beneath it all was a heart desperate to heal old wounds. Closing the chest gently, Grace whispered to the quiet room: "I need to find you, Miriam. I need to understand everything." The road ahead was darker than she imagined. The chill of early autumn crept through the trees as Grace drove out of Asheville toward the dense woods that bordered the town's outskirts. Beside her, Miriam sat quietly, her hands folded tightly in her lap, eyes fixed on the passing landscape as if searching for ghosts. Grace had reached out to Detective Mark Lawson, the retired officer who had worked on Annie's missing person case decades ago. Though time had blurred memories, he was willing to meet and share what little he remembered, and what had never been made public. At a small diner off the highway, Detective Lawson spread out faded case files, photographs, and a child's crayon drawing. Two women holding hands beneath a large oak tree. "That drawing," Lawson said, voice low, "was found near the edge of the woods about a week after Annie disappeared. It was never released. Too sensitive, they said. But it's unmistakably Annie and someone who looks like Ms. Whitmore." Grace's heart tightened as Miriam shifted uncomfortably beside her. "We always thought Annie ran away," Lawson continued. "The official story. But this drawing, it suggested otherwise. There were people who wanted the case to close quickly." Later, Grace and Miriam walked the forest trail the drawing had depicted. The canopy overhead filtered the golden sunlight into fragmented patterns on the leaf-strewn path. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the underbrush, sent shivers down Grace's spine. Miriam stopped abruptly, her voice breaking. "This is it," she whispered, voice trembling. "Where I left her." Grace's breath caught. The sister she barely knew was leading her into the heart of the mystery. They pushed through a thick thicket and came upon a small clearing. The ground was soft, overgrown, and almost hidden beneath roots and fallen leaves. Miriam sank to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't kill her. I swear," she sobbed. "But I failed her." Grace knelt beside her, heart aching. In that quiet, forgotten place, buried beneath years of secrets and silence, the truth waited patiently to be uncovered. The small town of Asheville awoke to a shock that rippled through every corner of its close-knit streets. Human remains had been discovered in the woods, the long-hidden truth finally unearthed beneath the roots and soil where Annie B. had been buried. DNA testing confirmed what no one dared say aloud for years: the remains were Annie's. News crews descended on the town, their cameras and microphones invading quiet homes and familiar faces. The headline on the local paper screamed, "The girl who vanished, a town's dark secret revealed." Miriam was taken into custody almost immediately. The media frenzy painted her in shades of guilt, suspicion, and heartbreak. Rumors swirled, fingers pointed, and whispers filled every corner cafe and church pew. Grace found herself caught in a brutal storm of public opinion. Some saw her as a victim, others as an accomplice. Questions about her role and knowledge of the past dragged her into the spotlight she had long avoided. Friends avoided her calls. Neighbors exchanged cautious glances. The quilt that once felt like a warm embrace now lay folded on her living room couch, heavy with sorrow. Yet, amid the chaos, Grace's resolve only grew stronger. She knew Miriam hadn't been the monster the headlines made her out to be, not entirely. Somewhere beneath the layers of tragedy and mistakes was a woman who had tried, desperately, to protect a child no one else could save. One afternoon, as the storm outside raged with a violent thunderstorm, Grace discovered a final square in the quilt, one that had never been stitched in. Nestled in an envelope inside a small wooden box was a piece of red ribbon, faded but carefully preserved. On it, sewn in tiny, perfect script, was a single word: safe. The ribbon, Grace realized, was Annie's favorite, the one she'd worn braided into her hair on the last day she was seen. Tears blurred Grace's vision, but she clung to that word, that promise. Somehow, in this fractured story of loss and love, there was still hope. The courtroom was packed with whispers and tension, every eye fixed on Grace Whitmore as she took the stand. The air was thick with the scent of polished wood and anticipation, and the heavy silence was broken only by the soft rustle of papers and the distant murmur of reporters. Grace's hands trembled slightly, but her voice was steady as she began to speak, her testimony a delicate blend of pain, truth, and fierce love. She told the court about Miriam, the sister she had lost and tried to understand. About the trauma that had shaped Miriam's mind and the misguided ways she had tried to protect children like Annie. "I never condoned her actions," Grace said softly, her eyes scanning the crowded room. "But I know, in my heart, she saved more children than anyone realized. One by one, former students stepped forward. Their faces were lined with time, but their voices were clear, some trembling as they recounted stories of Miriam's quiet interventions, her letters, her visits, the mysterious presence that had guided them through dark times. A young woman named Jessica Hart, now a social worker, spoke with conviction. Miriam may have broken the rules, but she acted out of love. Without her, I don't know where I'd be. The defense painted Miriam as a broken soul, trapped in a world of mental illness and guilt. But Grace's testimony humanized her sister, revealing a woman who was deeply flawed but driven by an unyielding desire to care for the forgotten. As the trial drew to a close, Grace received an unexpected letter. It was from Michael B., Annie's now-grown brother. "Thank you, Ms. Whitmore, for trying to give Annie the mother she never had. Your courage means more than words can say." Grace clutched the letter to her chest, feeling a fragile hope bloom amid the heartbreak. The court would decide Miriam's fate, but Grace knew some wounds would never fully heal. The late afternoon sun spilled golden light across Grace Whitmore's modest living room, casting long shadows on the worn wooden floorboards and the pale floral wallpaper. The air was thick with anticipation, soft murmurs from the gathered crowd, the faint scent of old paper mingled with blooming gardenias from the window vase. Today was a day Grace had never imagined she'd see, the unveiling of the completed quilt, the tapestry of a lifetime, stitched with stories, secrets, and sorrow. After months of heartache, revelation, and fragile reconciliation, the community had gathered. Former students, neighbors, local officials, and even a few of the town's skeptics who had once questioned Grace and Miriam's actions, all came to witness the quilt that had stitched together a fractured past. Grace stood near the fireplace, her slender fingers gently smoothing the quilt draped across a large oak table. Each fabric square glowed with history, fragments of denim, cotton, and flannel, embroidered with names, dates, and memories. The quilt was more than cloth and thread. It was a living monument to the children they'd all once been and the lives they'd built despite darkness. The room fell quiet as the youngest visitor stepped forward, a young woman with soft brown eyes and hesitant steps. She was tall, poised, yet shy, clutching a small, carefully wrapped bundle. Grace's heart caught as the young woman approached and lifted the corner of the quilt, revealing a pristine square, unstitched and waiting. "This is for you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Grace's gaze lifted, meeting the young woman's eyes, eyes that held a fragile hope and a quiet strength. "I'm Emma," the woman continued, "Annie's niece." A hush swept the room. Emma carefully unwrapped the bundle. Inside was a delicate square of fabric, soft and well-loved, a piece of deep crimson cloth edged in white embroidery. "This was my aunt's favorite fabric," Emma said, a faint tremble in her voice. The red ribbon she always wore braided into her hair. She smiled gently, tears glistening. "I wanted to add it, to complete the quilt, for the teacher who stayed." Grace's hands trembled as she reached out to take the square. The weight of the moment, the culmination of decades of pain, love, and unanswered questions, pressed on her chest. Slowly, Grace lifted a needle and thread. The room watched in respectful silence as she carefully stitched the square into place, her fingers steady despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. The final thread pulled tight, and the quilt was whole. A soft murmur of approval filled the room. Grace wrapped the quilt around her shoulders, feeling the warmth of every story stitched into the fabric. It was more than a legacy, it was a promise, to remember, to forgive, and to face the future with open eyes. The crowd began to share memories, laughter mingling with tears. Stories of children helped, lives changed, and wounds slowly healing. Miriam, now living in a care facility nearby, was unable to attend. But Grace had written to her every week, sending pictures and updates about the quilt and the healing it had inspired. Later that evening, Grace sat alone by the fireplace, the quilt folded across her lap. The house was quiet, the world outside settling into night. Her phone buzzed, a message from Emma. "Thank you, Ms. Whitmore, for everything." Grace smiled softly, her heart lighter than it had been in years. She thought of Annie, of Miriam, and of all the children whose lives had touched hers. The quilt was more than fabric, It was a testament to endurance, to love stitched through generations, and to the power of facing even the darkest truths. For the first time in a long time, Grace felt at peace, not because the past was perfect, but because she had chosen to embrace it. And in that choice lay the greatest gift she could ever give.